The targeting, just like I mentioned, that top batch is kind of like their tier one that they're going for to get the intel. But then they're also in telco, pharma, unfortunately, education, a lot of energy and technology. So they're hopping in there either to do collection or to use that as a second layer for their activities. So now we come back to like, well, what does that matter? How do I detect them, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about the TTPs. And so this is where I had to do some analysis to look at like, okay, there's a malware report, but what's the actual underlying behavior of what they're doing? And then I looked at it and was like, well, how rare is it that it's just them doing it? I only came up with really two TTPs that were kind of unique to them. So we'll start with initial access. That was a genius stroke when they took over Iran. So they took over somebody else's initial access and just said, that's mine, and started operating. Water holing, spearfishing, everybody does that. Use of valid accounts, that's all you see now. So you don't really know how they got in. They just came in with a valid account. So, it's kind of like a dirty secret for incident responders. Like you never really know how they got in. It just they logged in with something, and they got that access. Either they bought it, from somebody like a initial access provider, or it was from a previous compromise a long time ago. Then they're also backdooring Android APKs to get on target cell phones. So that's actually technically not that hard compared to maybe Apple is a little bit harder, but Android, as long as you trust who you're installing, you can load it in there. There's no vetting of those apps. Execution, like I said, nothing crazy here. I mean, Word docs with decoys, getting into memory via PowerShell. Everybody's doing this. Process injection, very similar. On the persistent side, though, they do have some pretty. I mean, they're operating. Their backdoors are JavaScript, .NET, and RPC. So they have this whole breadth of tooling that they can use, not just one. And so that matters because they often deploy multiple persistent mechanisms in a network. So if one gets taken out, they immediately have another one. And then they can decide to either go dormant and hide or try to do something else to piss off the target. Privesc, um, nothing here that's out of the ordinary except maybe the targeting of VMware drivers. That was how they got their rootkit. So if you've heard the Snake or Ubros rootkit, that was how they got that rootkit installed because the VMware drivers were kernel level. But yeah, interpreter, reflective DLL injection, all standard stuff here. Defense invasion, they've definitely upped their game. Seeing how they operated in the 90s and early 2000s was laughable. Like they didn't clear out the strings in their when they compiled their codes. Everything was there. And that's how people were able to kind of build a history about them. But now they're pretty good. They're bypassing all the security agents, bypassing Windows controls, much like our pen testers, right? Seems like they always get in. Credential access, all standard stuff. Don't even need to cover that. They do have some custom tooling on the lateral movement side, so that's something to pay attention to. It's not strictly living off the land and just using native Windows commands. Now, command and control. Now we get to the other item that's important with them is that they use satellite networks for exfiltration. So they're really smart in how they did this. They picked satellite providers that were in Africa because they couldn't be messed with by Interpol or NATO or any of that. So I know when I had to deal with a lot of Chinese intrusions, they knew like if they moved something to Europe that was protected by privacy, it was harder for us to respond. Well, if they start to throw stuff to Africa satellite providers and then it shoots up and it's in the air, who's going to stop it once it goes up into space, right? So then they just can sit back in St. Petersburg and capture that signal with all their data. So they're not the only one that use satellite networks. I think there's about three other actors that do this, but it's definitely something that's not common. And then another thing that they do really well is there's a lot of methods that they use to hide in plain sight, but they do really good with Gmail. So it's really hard to detect anything with Gmail. I mean, it's all encrypted. What are you going to look for? I mean, they're accessing Gmail. Well, your whole all your employees access Gmail, unless you're working at a government site where they block that stuff, which is pretty rare. And then on the exfil side, a lot of that hiding in plain sight, using OneDrive, using Box, and going to victim infrastructure. So this kind of paints the picture that they're not using anything cutting edge here, and really you've got two major things that they've done that stand out: satellite usage and then hijacking other threat actors' infrastructure. So now we're going to dive into kind of and all this is linked, so you can download this later and benefit from the research that I did. But we can walk through like their history of all their malware. And it started off with Loki 2, and they initially thought it was something called CDOR, which was talked about in Frack. That's how old this is. Frack was like a e-zine from a long time ago. I think it's still up and running, but it doesn't publish as often as it used to. So you're talking about a Unix backdoor. They were compromising like Solaris and IRIX. This is old school stuff. And then they started their Penguin backdoor, which is the Linux port. So that runs on Ubuntu, CentOS, and it's gone on forever because it works. Nobody's detecting it. One of the more genius things about that backdoor is it uses port knocking. So if you think of like Meterpreter, reverse shell, there's like a port 4444, and then it connects, right? Well, with the port knocking, they send a magic byte in the packet on any port. So 389, 445, it could be any port, it could be UDP, but it's got a magic byte in there, and that unlocks the communication. And so it's really just awesome how they do this. They'll deploy it everywhere, and it'll just stay stealthy. It just sit there. It doesn't talk out. It doesn't do anything. Nothing's hard coded, and then they'll wake it up with a magic byte, and then it'll talk to infrastructure that they've set it up just for that activity, that campaign. So they can continuously update it with the magic byte, and it'll talk to different infrastructure. So if you've blocked something in DigitalOcean, they'll just move it with another magic byte to another place. So it's a very, very cool way of doing things. And on the system, it just looks like cron. So it's appearing to be like cron on your Unix system. So they've continued to do tons of development. So Carbon and Cobra, that's their backdoor, and it leverages. It's similar to Comrat, that it leverages an encrypted VFS. So that's an entirely hidden file system on your computer. So it looks like a file, and then there's an encryption key in the registry, and then it just uses access to the registry to decrypt it, and all their crap's there hidden from you. You won't even see it. So Comrat, we'll go over that more. That's something that's probably their most famous tool. So that's Comrat is com object hijacking. So you'll see that in the registry because it's got com objects in the registry. Snake, we talked about a little bit. That's the one that was exploiting VMware driver. Skipper was another one of their first stage implants. So there was a lot of visibility on this one, and they were delivering it with Adobe Flash. So at the time, so now that Flash is kind of out, they've moved on to other things. Need to go through everything here, but the iced coffee and Kopi Luwak were interesting. Maybe that's them.
Probably.
Yeah, they sent the magic bite just right now. Yeah, so iced coffee, and I don't know who came up with these names, but they're coffee themed. Was their first JavaScript backdoor, so that was interesting because they keep evolving capabilities, and they have a whole suite of capabilities to come at you with. Gazer was definitely reported on a lot. That's their mode for moving files about and C2 and that kind of stuff. And then Kopi Luwak was the evolution of iced coffee, so same, following the coffee theme. So now I'll focus a little bit on their pivot to PowerShell. So obviously everybody's been doing, attackers for the last, 5-6 years, maybe longer, have been doing a ton of stuff in PowerShell. And so they were actually using commodity off-the-shelf PowerShell stuff, and then they decided to write their own PowerShell backdoor, which is PowerStallion. And they, I believe, created that with Power Support, and that's been really effective for them. Uh, Poison Frog, that was their nice little panel that they used to hijack the Iranian infrastructure. So they installed that. They took over their infrastructure, installed their own panel so they could admin all of the Iranian infrastructure. PyFlash, yet again, a new capability. Now they have Python. So look, they've got C Sharp, they've got all this old school Unix stuff. They're doing PowerShell, .NET, RPC. Now they've added Python to their repertoire. And then lastly, Tiny Turla, which was, I believe, reported by Cisco. And this is really cool, and this is something that I looked at because it was more recent. And what they did here was take advantage of hiding in plain sight. So if you're familiar with Windows, usually there's traditionally like a W32 something and a W64 something. Like there's two versions of the same file. So they found that there was only one version of W32 time. And so they pretended to be W64 time and like looks legitimate, right? And so they were able to hide for a long time with that. And then it's tiny, so it's only 13 kilobytes, hence the name Tiny Turla. Like I said, a good Cisco Talos report on that if you guys want to look into that. So now a little bit about the lineage. So I wanted to kind of show this, how you can see, and like I apologize, but you can see how this is the original agent BTZ that we talked about, and then it forked off and they created a new carbon backdoor, and then this developed into Comrade and a nice timeline. And really, what a lot of this shows, same up here, you can see all the versioning. It's showing that you've got a really dedicated staff of developers and security people focused on building these capabilities. It's not just fly by the night operation. And because they've, in a lot of cases, the reason they're able to find this out is because they link a lot of static binaries in their tools, so you can go see at the time what they were using, and that because that package was only available at a certain time, that allows you to apply the time to it. Because like say OpenSSL, like they were using a static library of OpenSSL. Well, that was only deployed for like 18 months, and then a different one came out. So that's how they added the time element here with the malware. Okay, so a little bit about their infrastructure. So they're able to pretty much do whatever they want. On the phishing, I was going to mention this to you because this is one of their newer tactics. What they were doing was sending out Word documents with an embedded PNG image, and they weren't doing any kind of exploit, but it was set up to just make a remote call. So in a Word document, it's a compound structure. You can embed all kinds of things into the document. So they embedded an image that was actually hosted on infrastructure that they can control. And all they did was just watch to see who opened it. So strictly reconnaissance. So that's how quiet they try to be. They don't try to smash and grab. They're really, really stealthy. And they were targeting a lot of NATO things around NATO and Ukraine stuff, and trying to get people to click on it and then see, okay, now we know where they're at, and then go after them. So that's something that was more recent. They're using web shells, spear phishing, watering holes. You can see the Tiny Turla reference there. And then really good at using all kinds of just shared platforms. It's like one of the best ways to hide in plain sight. Dropbox, Instagram, um, hiding things in Instagram comments, like just little dots, like they don't look like anything. That's how they can communicate over Instagram. And then the C2 as well. And so the thing here is there's a mix of things, right? So there's things that are generally kind of viewed as non-sophisticated, like Dropbox and just using a shared service, but they also have very complex backdoors, so they can deploy a range of things, which is kind of how you see APTs, right? There is basic when they need to be basic because they know that the target can't stop them, and then they can level up their capabilities and use more advanced things the more sophisticated their target is. So now I wanted to go over the Linux stuff because this is likely what, unless you're in policy diplomacy space, what if you're going to see them, this is probably what you'll see is they'll go after your Linux servers. There was a really good report by a Swiss defense company called RUAG that really detailed this penguin implant. And like I said, that came out. The report wasn't until like 2014, but it was actually observed in 2011. So look at the lag time there. That Swiss defense contractor didn't really talk or detect it until 3-4 years later. It doesn't require any root perms. They've kept it clean by stripping out all the symbols. It's still pretty large though. It does have requirements. So I was mentioning the OpenSSL before. It relies on a lot of open source libraries. They can track it because they all use blowfish encryption with the same initialization vector key. So the same key used on all of these. And then the same thing I was talking about before, the magic packet. That's exactly how it is right there. So on TCP, it's a specific ACK number, and then UDP, it's a location. So the second byte of the body. That's how they do it. Let's see. After. Yeah, and then one time they did use a hard-coded port, and that allowed a lot of reporting. So they used 1773 for a while, so people were able to hunt them and see all their satellite activity. So that was definitely a big win there when they did. I guess you could call it a mistake that they hard-coded it. And then in terms of behaviors, so on the Linux side, um, here's everything mapped to MITRE, so you kind of know what to look for. So to defend against this, you won't want to just write like one detection, but you're going to want to write a whole bevy of detections, and then probably have like your red team emulate it and see how they get around your detections. But like port knocking, remote file copy, all this crypto stuff, file modifications, you're going to need a layered defense. You won't. I would be surprised if you could do it only with EDR. You're going to need network as well, so you're going to need the whole suite. Um, and then a little bit more about some of the behaviors. Um, they were able to do like system profiling and make it look like just Google Analytics. So like all that advertising crap that you just ignore that Google is doing, that's what they pretended to look like, so you wouldn't really notice them. And then their file transfers were stored in under root in the session key and a HS performance data. So like I said, that's pretty innocuous. Like that wouldn't jump out to me as like this is an evil file. Oh, and then they exfilled through posts, so that's something that you could really detect on. So normal traffic is going to be more slanted towards gets, probably like 80% gets and maybe 20% posts, or even less than that. So when you see a lot of posts, it's good to investigate that and see what's exactly happening there, because oftentimes it can be a web shell. Question? Where it says use of JavaScript lead, like lead the browser. Yeah. Yep, that's it. Yep. So they were using that code and pushing it down to the system. Yes. Can you repeat the question? Yeah, the question was Beef, the browser exploitation framework, was an open source tool to basically run with JavaScript. So if you've got JavaScript enabled on your browser, it'll run that and start to profile your system for you and pull back like your IP, your browser version, your OS version, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, they definitely take advantage of a lot of open source tooling, and then eventually what they'll do is then get comfortable with it and write their own version of that open source tool. But yeah, thank you for that question. Okay, so what are they up to now? So, like I said, the conventional thinking is that they've kind of stopped their larger effort with all of Europe and all of Central Asia and kind of pulled back just to focus on Ukraine a little bit, because I guess we all see how that war's going. It's not necessarily not a win for them by any means. So Google Tag's been tracking a lot of their activity because they see a lot of it via their email platforms, and that was they were targeting some stuff in Germany, some stuff in NATO, and using that a remote image docx that I told you guys about, and using a lot of like it's opportunistic, right? Ukrainian war themes. So like, here's an update on the war, and somebody's who's not gonna open that, right? And then this is where the more even recent reporting on how they created this Android app. So they pretended to be a Ukrainian like anti-Russian app. So it was an app to DOS the Russians, but it was really that's what it looked like. But then it was actually the Russians collecting information on the Ukrainians that were downloading it. So it was pretty solid tactic there. And all it really did was send like one ping. And so it wasn't actually DOSing anything, but it was revealing information about the Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian people who were installing the app. So, and that was by Sequoia, you can see there. So Sequoia and Google Tag have been doing a lot of reporting this year on Turla. So that's kind of what they've been up to lately. And one thing I wanted to share with you guys is a way to kind of rank them. So it can help sometimes to put things in buckets. And this is a model that I came up with about 5 years ago or 6 years ago when I was at CrowdStrike. And specifically, it was because I got frustrated with people saying, "Well, they were so sophisticated, nobody could have stopped them." Well, you can't really say anything to that because it's just like it's a claim that you can't disprove because you weren't there, you weren't the responder, you don't know what happened. Maybe they were that good, but a lot of times when you see the report, you're like, well, that's not that crazy. Like we could have stopped that. And so this is a method to start to score how they operate to say, okay, are they really, really that good? And so from an earlier presentation, I mapped out some other threat actors. So what you'll see there is equation group on the top right. I don't even need to say who that is. And then on the bottom left is Anonymous. And then you have Carbonac, who is a very successful e-crime operator for a long time. And then that image there, I believe, is Silent Kalima, Lazarus. And then the Turla image there is where I've rated them. So in terms of attack precision, they're pretty good. On a lower side is just like spray and pray, cred stuffing, just opportunistic, and then the higher side is very, very precise. They're not wasting any extra keystrokes. Cross-platform capability, they're on obviously Windows and Linux, but also Mac. So they have a Mac tools, and they also were on Android. I couldn't score them higher because I just don't have the information to say that they were embedded computing or supply chain compromised. They probably have, but I just don't have that information, so I can't change my rating there. There was actually some reporting by Kaspersky that thought that they were behind SolarWinds, but there's disagreement on that, so it's hard to say. Some people said it was, I believe, Cozy Bear, and then other people said it was Turla. I don't think it was Turla, honestly, but I think it's just something that's up for debate. Targeting, very strong, so they're going after hard targets. I couldn't give them anything but a 10 because they compromised the classified network that's air-gapped, so good for them, bad for us. OPSEC, I wanted to give them a stronger score, like 10, but I couldn't because they've actually had they'll get on and, like, similar to some of the Chinese operators, do personal business on adversary infrastructure. And then they've left a lot of notes too, like making fun of the CIA and like calling out things in their tooling. So mixed results. I mean, they're overall really good because they're there for a long time, but they've also had some pretty bad OPSEC breaks. Resilience is really strong because they have multiple implants, and something that they did, this is actually documented, a lot of times when they're discovered, they'll just go silent, and then like Mandy and our CrowdStrike comes in and they're not doing anything, and then as soon as they go away, then they'll spin up again. Well, what they did in this one incident is they actually started dropping a bunch of Chinese malware. So they knew that if they dropped that, then the responders would come in and see that and think, oh, this is China, and take the investigation a different route. So kudos to them again. And then obviously their stealth. I mean, one of the longest running compromises. You're talking about 5 to 10 years in many cases where they can stay on a network with just the same tooling, not even having to change it. So overall, that's where I have them ranked. It's something that I'll link to so you guys can see the actors model kind of scores, so you can have an idea of like what you're dealing with. It helps kind of understand. The more you understand about your adversary, the easier it is to start to try to plan to defend against them. And I think with that, I will wrap up. I think I'm right at 45, right? Okay. So any happy to answer questions.
So how does the actor's paradigm translate to effectiveness and sophistication?
So the actors paradigm measures the sophistication, so the X part of that graph, and then effectiveness is going to be based on all their campaigns. So where you've seen them be successful. So like the one that was right by them, the Axiom Aurora Panda, like they got into Google with that 0 day, so they're very skilled. So that's kind of where I have them in terms of effectiveness. They're a little bit ahead on sophistication because of all they've been going on for so long, and they're just sheer amount of development that they do for all their tooling. But yeah, that's basically it's that X bar. So more sophisticated, further are you to the right, and then the more effective you are, because you can be really effective and like especially a lot of these ransomware operators are just killing it. They're making so much money, but they're not sophisticated. So that's how you kind of got to look at it. So the farther you are to the top on the right, the more you need to be worried about them. Yes, back.
Were they involved in the shadow brokers breach?
I don't. Yeah, I don't have any firm information to say that either way. Um, I don't think anybody's come out specifically and said. I mean, I think everybody believes it's Russia, but I don't know exactly which unit within Russia. Probably not them, because like I said, they're classic espionage. So they're, like I said, their track record is they don't have a lot of indictments against them. They're not flashy. They like to stay below the radar. Versus some of the other ones like Black Energy, Sandworm, they're being real aggressive, and so they're different from Turla. They're going out to like disrupt and cause instability with people. Versus these guys are just trying to collect old school espionage.
Yeah, I was thinking because of the Iran takeover that there might be a case for.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's just still unknown at this point. Yes, right here.
How are they funded?
Well, I mean, they've got government funding, so they're part of the FSB. So they've got also, if you look at it, Putin was a KGB guy, so he's going to fund the FSB the most. Recently, if you've been following the Ukrainian news, Putin is totally at odds with the head of the SVR, which is like the CIA. He actually, if you saw the news conference, like totally humiliated him in front of everybody on global television. So it just seems like the FSB right now has the spotlight. Like it's the equivalent of like your CISO has his favorite team and gives them all the budget, like whatever team that is, and then it seems like that's funding isn't a problem. And then there's also some more recent reporting that like it's a partnership. So there's actual like private companies. There's two that were mentioned. One was called Atlas of the FSB, and then the other one was called Center for Information. So there's these. I don't know if you'd call. I can't say that they're like front companies, but it's kind of like real top-notch private sector guys that are like out of the military, but they are operating for the FSB. Cool. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for your attention, and thanks for coming out this early in the morning. Thank you.